So, Dave, how has
Yeah.
the concept of retirement evolved since you first introduced it? And what new trends or behaviors are you observing amongst some of the retirement community?
Well, it's been really interesting. To be honest, I think the idea of retirement first bubbled up about 13 years ago. Um, but realistically, it was a sort of term I used at the back end of, and as an example in some presentations and stuff and some discussions. But then really, I would say 2019, just before the pandemic hit, I started to see more examples of people either posting on Facebook or wherever about their own efforts to retry things. Um, or during COVID, lots of interesting things. There's a guy that you and I know who basically took off with his wife, and they've spent the last 4 years just. I think they're up to about country 90. They're just traveling around the world, and he does his own business online, but it was that idea of I'm going to retry life by instead of being stuck in Brisbane or Melbourne, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to be wherever the world takes me, and we're just going to travel the world, and I'm going to do it from any park bench I happen to be sitting on. That's one interesting form of retirement, right? To take what you do, but do it in a totally different way. What I did notice over COVID was that because a lot of us were stuck physically, um, and maybe not able to get out, that we started to see a lot more people in that sort of 50, 60, 70s age group start to talk about retrying things. Now, that might have been because they were stuck in their apartment, their house, whatever, and they were going to do a course, right? And I always wanted to do a course on interior design. So now I'm doing that. And by the way, I managed to pick up a friend of a friend who is going to actually pay me to do this, and help out, right? So we started to see more stories about that. As we came out of COVID, what I started to see though was, and I don't know whether it was COVID that sort of forced this, but a lot more people in Australia and elsewhere starting to come to realities with that growth in the 60s, 70s population, and also the realization that when you're in your 60s and 70s, you're still probably 20 years from dying, from croaking, or from being towards the end, right? That you've still got a lot of activity. So we saw more and more people talking about it. A good friend of mine, a lady named Sue Bell, who lives in Sydney, she's a market researcher who specializes now in retirement studies. And she basically, again, almost by accident, was approached by a government department to look at some issues around retirement, ended up working with a bunch of insurance companies and other companies who were all looking at and rethinking the retirement population. And one of the things that she has quantified was the fact that when we say the word retirement today in Australia, it can mean she's identified 5 different types of retirement. One is that classic, we're going to downsize, move to the beach and fish, right? But that's a tiny proportion of people. Now, that's partly because a lot of people can't afford to do that. But it's also because a lot of people choose not to do that, right? A lot of people choose to carry on with their work life, but either try to downsize that work life or maybe change that work life in some ways. Some people, it's about trying new things. So going back to school, education, etc., courses. Some people, it can be as simple as just finding hobbies that, are really maybe much more impactful hobbies or things to keep you busy, charity, those sorts of things. So what I'm seeing is, first of all, is people like her, not just in Australia, but around the world, more and more people doing actual research on the way to rethink these things. But we're also seeing organizations developing that are changing it. So, for example, about 2 years ago, roughly, some people in the advertising industry, which is my background, got together and created a thing called EAT, the Experience Advocacy Task Force. So this is very senior people from a bunch of ad agencies, media agencies, etc., who have got together and are basically advocating that around ageism in the advertising industry. And as you may know, classically, if you look at the statistics, the advertising industry is one of the worst in terms of being ageist, in terms of their employees.
Mm,
So the proportion of people over 45 working in the advertising industry in Australia is much less than in any other average industry.
mm,
What they're doing is putting together different platforms to advocate for the fact that the ad industry itself has to make space for more people in their 50s and 60s, that we have to think about retraining, both in terms of retraining those people if they need it, but also finding ways in which they can help retrain younger people. And then more importantly, how to mix experiences. So you would know, Campbell, from what you do, that it's so important that you get people that have mixed experiences and bring them together, so that those with more experience can teach and those with less experience can offer up ideas and bounce ideas around, right? So
mm.
we're seeing lots of those sorts of things happening.
That's awesome, and that raises lots of questions in my mind about um, the aging population, ageism, um, challenging stereotypes, and retirement. One of the things that I was just thinking when you were talking about during COVID and that sort of stimulated retirement in one sector of the demographic, in a way, it triggered trying new things in nearly all the segments. All of a
Mm.
sudden you saw people trying baking for the first time,
Yeah,
or painting or whatever
yeah,
it may be. And I guess the more I think about retirement, and we've been talking about it, in this kind of forum for a couple of years, is that, that's something that all ages in society should be taking advantage of, is trying new things, being open to new things, all the time. And I think people are, but what it leads is like the example of the marketing organizations that are still stuck in their ways, and I think most businesses are still stuck in their ways. They
sure.
they dip their toe in the water with this work from home thing, but that's not really breaking the paradigm of what organizations
You're right.
structures are about. In introducing more or wider opportunities for their employees and their people.
Yeah,
Um,
you're exactly right. I mean, if we take the work from home thing, remote working, part-time, mixed working, those sorts of things. Obviously, different people have different needs and wants, right? For some people, going to the work is a great opportunity, like for
yeah.
socialization, if nothing else. I think I mentioned to you before that over COVID, I was doing some studies of the way people were reacting to working from home for three or four large corporations. And I was doing this across Asia Pacific, in major cities across Asia Pacific. And one of the things I found was the number of people who said that the thing they miss most about working from home was the commute, because that was the perfect time for separation of work and home life, and having some time just to think on my own or listen to music or listen to Campbell Elliott on a podcast, right? But the other thing they really talked about was the coffee break, and what was called casual ideation and fellowship. And that basically is, when you go to an office, when you go to a factory, whether or not you like the job or whatever, you usually find people, they have a ritual of the coffee break, or go smoke a fag down on the street, at 10 o'clock in the morning. And you know what? Every time I go down at 10 in the morning, there's this guy Campbell who doesn't work in the same company, but he works in the same building or across the road. He's always there, and we have a bit of a natter. And you know what? I may never see him otherwise, but I sort of miss that. Or, I miss building friendships which happen in that cauldron of the life space versus the virtual. But at the same time, you've got other people who will basically take comfort in the fact that, look, and it could literally be like, physically, I just don't feel like making the effort to go to that place,
Mm.
but I'm perfectly capable of doing the job, right? So we have to have, I think, more of that mix and that awareness that for the older population, there will be sometimes physical things where they require either to be or not to be at places, but they also appreciate the chance to interchange and mix with people of other age groups.
Mm.
And one of the things that really disappoints me is when I hear, especially in my world or the marketing world, but the general business world, the constant talk about boomers and Gen Zs and, and all this sort of stuff. I keep on going, well, wait a minute. If I'm a boomer, right, it's only because I was born between these years and some demographer gave me that name.
Mm.
But the truth is that I share a lot of interests with people of all age groups, and my musical taste might be slightly different. But guess what? I got off on music, they get off on music, and sometimes it's a good thing to listen to theirs and them to listen to mine, right? Now,
Yeah.
that a chance to intermingle is really important.
100%. And I guess that's where, people that work predominantly at home need to find other avenues to be able to interact and have those
Right.
water cooler moments, whether it's walking the dog or, getting outside. And I guess that's part of the readjustment for those people. Thinking about organizations and skills and experience of employees. I mean, how do you think that organizations can better leverage the skills and experience of employees in their 60s and 70s, to enhance productivity and innovation?
I think that first of all, you have to forget about stereotypes, right? You have to forget about the stereotypes. Well, people of a certain age group are, digital natives, right? So you've heard me talk. I really rail against this concept that you can't be a digital native if you're over 35 or set an age, right? I mean, I always talk about the number of people I know that are now in their 60s who have been using mobile phones for 40 years, right? So when are you a digital native? What defines that, right? People will say, well, it's people that are only use digital platforms. And I'll go, yeah, well, that's funny because all the research says that the most successful form of advertising for people under 35 is outdoor signage. So that's not necessarily digital. One of the things we have to do is get rid of all those boundaries and realize that some of us are always going to be slower on the uptake of certain things. Some of us enjoy certain types of interactions or working alone on issues. We tend to, I think in the business world, and you would know more about how businesses think about this than maybe me, but it always seems to me businesses sort of flip-flop between, we want everybody, we want to create a community of discussion, right? Yeah. Or we want to create a business where everybody knows their tasks and is very clear on their personal tasks. Well, it's not one or the other. Yeah. My working experience over the last 40, nearly 50 years is it's a lot of everything, right? And you can't define people by that. I think the other big thing is, and the change that probably is the reason why your business is successful, is a lot of people realizing that, in the old days, somebody interviewed me recently about talking to people that are going for job interviews. And they were asking me about things. And then they got onto, so how important do I think it is the CV is versus the cover letter, right? And I said, well, first of all, I personally always prefer the cover letter to the CV. I trust that more, right? Because the cover letter sort of shows some personality. The CV is a list of maybe things they did, right? And of course, we tend to all overclaim in a CV. Every human being on the planet does that. But more importantly would be, the problem I have with CVs is that it locks people into a particular mindset, right? So if a company puts out, we need X, somebody to do this role, and they get 50 or 100 CVs, somebody sits there and literally is like in 5 minutes for each one going, no experience with this, no experience with this, experience with this. Now, that could be literally because on that CV, I didn't put a certain word.
Yeah.
And so, for example, to what you do, I may list the projects I've worked on or I've led, etc., but I may not mention team building because I think, well, that's just part of background of what I do, right?
Yeah.
Whereas you would be smart enough to go ask the questions to discover, well, actually, Dave, you've led teams in like 6 countries and you've done this and cross-cultural teams and this was, huh, well, that's got to be the equivalent of a
Yeah.
third of an MBA just on its own, right? Or whatever that might be, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think that's one of the things that organizations need to be more flexible in their thinking about that.
Yeah, no, 100%. And just picking up on that, it's this idea that, um, you know, skills and knowledge are required, in a classroom. And yes, they most certainly are. And if everyone, 30 people that are all in the same classroom should have acquired the same skills and knowledge. Now, if they had have acquired that skills and knowledge in workplaces, different workplaces, well, they would have acquired slightly different flavors of those same skills and knowledge. And so I guess, what we're saying in terms of organizations is the more the greater diversity we can have,
Yeah.
and our focus in our discussion is around age mainly. If the greater diversity we can have in age, the more innovation and possible productivity improvement we can get. Because
Oh,
there's
absolutely.
different
Absolutely.
ideas.
I, a great example of that was talking to a friend of mine in Australia not long ago. Excuse me. Talking to a friend of mine in Australia not long ago, and he now works as a sort of independent consultant in a particular industry. He's about my age. He's got decades of experience, all that sort of stuff. One of the things that he's found most useful when he gets asked to work with a company in Australia in this particular category is to say to the manager or the managing director or whoever's hired him as the consultant is to say, do you mind if I spend the first couple of days just talking to the staff? And he'll go down and he'll talk, he'll go down to the factory floor or to, the wholesale department or the guy that's stacking the boxes in the delivery truck or whatever it is, and talk to them about what they're doing and then what he could help them with, right? And of course they'll go because and of course he's not going to turn up in a suit and tie if he's talking in the factory floor,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
he'll explain, look, hey, I've done a bit with the delivery systems of this particular type of product, I've been, and he finds it interesting to find people that ask interesting questions and then put them together in little teams, right? What could we do about this? So he's adding his decades of experience but asking them to bounce it in. And some of the people he's asking are 20 something and some are 40 something or older, but, bouncing around ideas within an organization. And as a very experienced guy, using himself as a bouncing board, but being very open to Campbell, what do you reckon is the big issue with what you're doing or with what the company is
yeah.
doing and your role in it, right? And I think there needs to be a lot more of that sort of use of experience, whether it's the role of a pretty well-known consultant in an industry, or whether it's literally the guy who maybe is the 60-year-old truck driver, right? And has been driving his whole life, and like, well, what do you know, right? Well, what's the tricks of the trade? How do you get around this?
Yeah, how would you solve this problem? And because but everyone thinks differently, and particularly people that have been in that role. And just picking back up on one of the things you mentioned earlier, we were talking about, or a barrier for people in their 60s and 70s, a perceived barrier, might be around technology. But the reality is technology continues to evolve over a
Yeah,
period of time. And I know one of the things that you've mentioned in the past is that people in their 60s and 70s are adaptable to change because they've had to be adaptable to change over the
exactly.
journey. And, if we're talking about technology, that's not age based. Some people are tech savvy or more open to, working with gizmos and gadgets. It's not that it's technology or a mobile phone or whatever. I think, that is a stereotype that is,
Exactly. And it's interesting because if you look around the world in a lot of not, I was going to say the more developed markets. It's not true, because it's also true for a lot of, I don't know what the politically correct term for the opposite of developed markets is anymore,
Yeah.
but things like seniorpreneurs, right? So the idea, I mean, I think we've all seen those studies that have been around now for about 20 years that sort of showed that the most successful entrepreneurs are 45 plus. Yes, there is the rare guy
Yeah.
who is a child prodigy, but on a day-to-day basis, most successful entrepreneurs are 45 plus. Why? Because they have 20, 25 years of experience of life, of business, of doing stuff.
Failures
Right?
of
Yeah, right. And they're more cautious. And they're basically, in building their business, they're more cautious. They'll think it through, and they'll draw upon other people. But we're also seeing, say, in the digital world, one of the fastest growing areas is senior influencers. So this idea of the influencer on TikTok or whatever, it's a huge thing. Look on TikTok. The fastest growing area of TikTok is people over 50 as influencers on TikTok. So what we're finding is, yes, as is always the case with personal technologies, we might think younger people get onto it first because they tend to be more flashy about it. But the reality of it is that older people learn to use it, and then to learn to use it in their own particular way. The problem is that business people and the media has to understand that different people will use mediums in different ways. So just because we see a certain segment of the population using TikTok or X or any other social medium doesn't mean that because you don't use it in the same way, you don't know how to use it, or you're not using it in the right way. You're just using it differently. And I personally, because I spend my life across Asia Pacific looking at projects for all sorts of companies using all sorts of mediums across Asia Pacific, I can see this where there are mediums that are very popular, say here in Thailand where I live, like Line, which is by far the number one messaging system, which basically doesn't exist in Australia. Now, does that mean that Thais are dumb or Australians are dumb? Well, It doesn't mean either, right? It's just for one reason or another, that platform took off here. It failed to take off in Australia. LinkedIn is a good example. In Australia, we think of LinkedIn as the primary business social media platform. In some countries I do work with, Bangladesh, for example, LinkedIn is there. There's millions of LinkedIn, but people do their business social communication through Facebook. They think that's the platform for business activity, right? So it just depends on the market and the background and why one thing has taken off more than another. And then we learn to adapt to it. And you're right. The fact that, I'm sitting here in my mid-60s and doing Zoom links with you so you can create a podcast, and I'm saying I'm sitting here with this young guy, Campbell, and, a lot of people are going, no, that's two old guys, right? So, it depends on what your point of view is, right?
Yeah. Now, 100%, 100%. So thinking about challenges and opportunities faced by individuals in their 60s and 70s who are still active in the workforce, and, I think more and more that's many, many people. How can these be addressed, to maximize their impact?
Well, I think first of all, you're correct. It's going to be more and more people are going to stay on working throughout their 60s, 70s, into their 80s. Every day we see more and more examples of that. If you read the Guardian newspaper, right, they actually have a weekly feature, which they've had now for over a year, which is they pick somebody who's usually in England, occasionally in Australia, but it's somebody who in their 60s has changed their work. Basically, they've changed their direction. They don't use the term retirement, but is literally case studies of retirement. So that's now in the popular media. That's becoming more and more there. And one of the common factors when you start talking to these people is something inside them that they wanted to try to do. Now, it could be something they've wanted to try for their whole working lives. The guy who I knew who was a doctor who in his late 50s went and did a history degree because he always wanted to be an historian. But because his doctor father had told him, no, you have to be a doctor, that's what he got stuck with, right? But on the other hand, you also have people who basically later in life decide, I want to become an entrepreneur in the social media space, right?
Yeah.
I want to start selling products online. So what they need is the facility where they are allowed to think about what I could do, what I want to do, what I dream of doing, and there are facilities that will allow me to get there. Now, that might mean retraining. That might mean recognition, in your case, recognition of things, capabilities I have, which are, as I said before, are not on my black and white CV. It's not a list of job titles I've had. It's, well, Dave, give me a stupid example.
Well, it might be around flower arranging, and you've
Flower arranging.
always been passionate about potted plants in your apartment.
Right. Well, here's the thing. My beloved wife, who is Australian, half Italian Australian, we lived in Japan for 10 years. She became a high level, like karate, there's different levels in flower arranging in Japan. She became one of the highest level foreigners in Japan, right? She would love to, I know she would love to go and share that knowledge, right? Now, basically what she needs is somebody just to encourage that, not me, because she never listens to what I say, but that's the perfect example, right? There are literally a couple of million 60, 70-year-olds sitting around in the big cities of Australia and the not so big cities of Australia who would like to do something else. Maybe they don't realize what it is.
Yeah.
Or maybe they only have a vague idea, but a lot of them will be sitting there going, yeah, but I don't really have the qualification. I don't have the formal knowledge. Why would anybody listen to me just because, I've been a plumber all my life, but at night I've loved to do this. And then turning that into something real, they need a push.
Yeah, but it's the push. It's the so what I think it stems from is you only need to go back 150 years, let's say, and people only lived till they were 50, 60, right? Give or take. And so by the time you left school, you pretty much had time for one job.
Right.
And so we always said, and then so the education system was built around that. Oh, you're good with numbers, you can be an accountant. You're good, you're a bit artistic, you're going to be an artist, so on and so forth. And people went off and did that. And our education system is still the same, right? Where you go to preschool, primary school, high school. Then some people go off and do a trade or go to university and do a trade there in a vocational field. And then that's all they do. And society is built around that. You're only allowed to do one thing. What do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be whatever it is. What needs to change with the idea of retirement and moving it away from the retirement, but trying things is there needs to be this facility that at 30, you can go to uni again. At 40, you can go to uni again. At 50, you can go to uni again.
Well, and this is a great point. Let me just interrupt you. This idea of going back to education. So we've seen this, and I've just seen in the last week a lot of reports in the US about people in their 60s, etc. A big wave going back to university. The question always is, why are they going back to university? Is it as a hobby? Like eventually I will go back and finish my degree in Renaissance Italian history, which is a bit of a passion point, but it has no commercial value, right? It's a hobby thing. A lot of people go back to university to do that, right? But some people go back to university because they want to learn something in an area they've always been interested in.
Yeah.
But whether you go back to university or you go to a TAFE course or you go to local community college or whatever it might be, what you need is to have the facility around you that people recognize, not just that, oh, you now got that qualification, but no, you've got an inquiring mind. That's the more important thing, right? You've got a mind that is open and is learning things. Every now and again, you'll see that headline about the other day it was a 102-year-old who had finally got her doctorate, right?
Awesome.
Awesome. But the way it's sort of half written, there's a sort of what a freak.
Yeah.
It doesn't
Yeah.
say that, but it's implied. Like, what a freak of nature, right? It's like, no,
Yeah.
no, wait a minute. What if we thought about that as normal, right? That
Mm.
we always say, I mean, especially in the last 15 years, but especially during COVID and post-COVID, we've talked about this continual learning that
Mm.
people like your kids in their late teens will have to continually learn, continually change jobs. Why can't that apply to people that are my age or your age or anywhere in between, right? That we have this continual learning thing, that we go off and we learn new skills, new techniques, maybe new areas that we, didn't exist. Because let's face it, what is it? Something like 70% of the jobs that are on the market in Australia today did not exist when I was 25, right?
Yeah.
So naturally, I had to get into different areas. I mean, I do a lot in the social media marketing area now. Well, what we call social media marketing now is a product of the last 15 years. So
Yeah.
you know what? I was already hitting 50 when this thing just got started. So, I was written off. And now I'm sort of getting 2 nights ago, I was at the number one MBA school in Bangkok giving a lecture on social media.
Yeah.
What do you
Yeah.
do?
What's this old guy going to tell us?
Yeah, right. Well, you could see that some of the students, you could see when literally, who the F is this guy?
Yeah.
Worse still that I was, who's this effing white guy going to
What
tell
old
us?
white guy?
Yeah.
Old white guy's going to tell us stuff again. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. We could chat all day, but
Yeah.
I'm just going to throw a couple of words at you and
Yeah.
just get your immediate thoughts because we sort of kicked off like this. What are your thoughts on the phrase "the new normal"?
Okay. My attitude was that right from the early stages of the COVID 2 years, when that term came to the fore, was no, it's not a new normal. It's stuff we always knew was coming. It's just sped up. And what happened was that the COVID years sped a lot of things. Work from home, for example, right? As we said, I think we were talking earlier, the Jetsons were predicting that 60 years ago. So we've always thought work from home would be normal. It's just because of the pandemic, it pushed things on. And we see that with most of the things that we talked about as the new normal. Well, no, that's actually things we had long been working towards. But instead of it now taking 20 years, it crashed through in 2 or 3 because of the crisis period that we lived. And remember that the history of mankind has shown that major crises like wars, like massive
Mm,
pandemics, always speed up the development of
technology.
technology and the change of implications of society, etc.
And what about this last phrase, work-life balance?
Yeah, I've never been a big believer that this is a thing. I think the marketing world really created work-life balance about 10 years ago, and it's obviously a good way in which to sell certain types of services and products. To be honest, yes, we can always go back and dredge out of history indications that say, oh yeah, but people used to work themselves to death. We can also drag that up today. And so, for example, in the gig economy, where we often hear the stories of the really smart 25-year-old who's got 5 jobs going at the same time, but what's now coming to the fore is the 25-year-old who's got 5 jobs going at the same time and literally dies at their desk at home. And there was a classic story in Japan recently about a young guy like that who nobody found him for 5 days until the smell started to waft through the door of the apartment, right? And this is just a reality, So work-life balance is something that we have to be very careful of. Actually, I think organizations can always encourage that more, but individuals may or may not resist it.
Awesome. Dave, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Campbell. Always good to talk to you, mate.